Come join Melissa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I virtually invite people into the blog cabin to chat about life. Today we have return guests Laura and Joy. They wrote Street Smart Safety for Women, and today we're going to focus on the topic of domestic violence. But first, tell us a little bit about yourselves for those that are just tuning in and didn't listen to the other episode, which they need to go listen to.
Hi, I'm Joy Farrow. I'm a retired deputy sheriff. I started my career in South Florida working for the Pompano Beach Police Department and the Broward Sheriff's Office. I worked road patrol, handling every possible call you can think of. Rape, robbery, domestic violence was number one around the clock. I did not start my day without handling a domestic violence call. And every other violent felony, misdemeanors, anything you could think of, I have handled in nearly 30 years.
Mm.
Yeah. And my name is Laura Frombach. I am a former technologist and survivor of family violence. And one of the inspirations, if you will, or one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was not only because of the history of my family violence, and it was generational in my case. You know, my grandparents, my uncles, you know, it was as generational as, you know, many other generational diseases that people talk about. But my turning point, my aha moment, if you will, was when I realized that my mother's mental illness was a direct correlation of domestic violence. And the reason I say that is because as an adult, my mom's family, my grandparents and my aunt kept saying, my mother wasn't always like that because my mother was mentally ill. And her family would say she was the nicest girl, the nicest young lady anybody knew. What could have happened? And so they would come to me and ask me. And, you know, I knew that we grew up with violence, but I just took it for granted. So I kept saying I had no idea. Just a few years ago, I thought, oh my gosh, could it have been the violence? And finally that clicked for me. And when I started to research traumatic brain injury and, you know, the brain disease that occurs as a result of violence, you know, it was just really, as I said, a game changer, an aha moment for me. And that's what led me to write the book, because we want people, especially women, to know about what happens, and that there are precursors, and that domestic abuse and domestic violence are actually patterns and they don't happen out of the blue.
Well, I want to share my story. I myself have not been a victim, but my grandmother, my dad's mom, was a victim of domestic violence. They would get back together long enough to make a baby. Then he would hit her, and then she would leave, and they'd get back together. That happened, I think, 8 or 9 times. I mean, to the point where I think, honestly, that part of her being legally blind later in life was because she was a victim of domestic violence. So I think this is a very important issue, because a lot of people, when they think of domestic violence, they're like, well, women can just leave, but that's not always the case. So let's talk about that.
Okay. Right. They can't always leave. And there are so many reasons for that. First of all, in my mom's case, it was financial. You know, especially back in the day, but that doesn't mean that's not the case today, because so many women are financially dependent on their partner. The other thing, and I think that is so important for people to realize, is that domestic violence and abuse are a pattern of domination and control. So let's look at the violence as an incident that is punishable by law. You know, the police come. Somebody calls the police come, it's an act of violence, and somebody goes to jail. domestic abuse is really more the emotional and the mental control of one person by another. And it's actually been correlated to brainwashing, because the victim is just worn down to the point of really doubting their own reality. And we use the terms narcissism and gaslighting quite a bit in our society. But in the patterns of domestic abuse and coercive control, which it is, it's being controlled by a threat, that the narcissist, let's just say the perpetrator, really distorts the reality field, distorts the mental perception of the victim to the point where they really don't realize what is true and what isn't true. So when you put those together with the financial control that so many women are the victim of, it's a powerful pattern that's not always obvious from the outside. And one of the things I realized, in doing the research for our book is, if you look at a domestic violence or domestic abuse situation and you just look at it from the outside in, it's really not explainable unless you think of the woman as being in a cell, in a jail cell or a prison cell. And that was certainly the case with my mom. And she never left the house. I mean, literally did not go outside the door for almost 20 years. She could have. My dad wasn't home most of the time, but she could have walked out anytime she wanted. But if you think of her as being in a jail cell, a mental or an emotional prison, then it makes sense.
Wow. I mean, that I didn't even think about that being, and I know you're an emotional, and the violence, but still, not having. People always think when women are like, oh, it's their fault. Let's talk about that, because shaming the victims should not happen at all.
It should not happen. And even when you think of any type of violence against women, the victims are ashamed. The victims often don't report to the police. I mean, how many unreported crimes of violence against women are there that go unreported because the victim is ashamed? They're ashamed of what happened. And, we're not ashamed when cancer happens. We're not ashamed of when we get other diseases. We have empathy for the victim. We have concern for the victim. However, in almost any type of crime or violence against another person, it's the victim who's shamed. And, that's an interesting quirk, if you will, in our society.
Well, and also, can I add that, a lot of the victims, co-workers, family and friends, may see their spouse as a nice person. They've played ball with them, they've hung out with them, and they can't imagine that they're this type of violent person. So that's where it's also awkward for the victim to tell their friends this, because fear of them not believing that the nice person that they've been going out to dinner with and going to the movies and, having these good times at Disney, and all of a sudden when they come home and the door closes, the fists go flying and the fear starts. So it's very hard for people to take in that concept, but you have to believe the victim.
And the victims themselves have been led to believe that, they're at fault. I mean, how many times it seems like a cliche, see what you made me do. And the victim themselves starts to believe, and I think that's where the wearing down of the victim comes. If I don't set this person off, if I don't set off this cycle, then the violence, or then the abuse, or even the verbal threats won't happen. And the truth of the matter is that no one person can make somebody else do something. I mean, go ahead and try and convince somebody of something against their will, and you can't do it. I mean, it's literally impossible.
That is so true. And I'm going to go piggyback on something Joyce said about things done in the dark, like things that were hidden that people don't even know about. What are some of the signs that we can actually to see if someone's a victim of domestic abuse? Because they're good at hiding things.
Yes, they are. And sometimes victims will start to pull themselves away from family. They'll start to isolate more. They'll start to withdraw. They won't do the activities that they used to do with just their friend. Maybe the boyfriend or the husband always has to come along where they never did before. Why are they showing up now? And the victim will have to make excuses for that. Sometimes it's the change in the way they look altogether. They used to have their hair done. They used to be beautiful, we'll say, all the time, always done up. And now they're not. And their clothes are different. And maybe they don't show themselves off as much as they used to in the clothing that they wear. And the colors have changed. And they're not wearing short sleeves, and the clothes are improper for the weather. So because they're hiding, bruises or making excuses for the way they look or the way they feel, or they can't leave the house. I don't feel well today. So a lot of these signs, they're missing work, making excuses for that. But if you're a close friend and you start to feel somebody pull away for no reason, that's a time, and you realize that nothing happened. What happened? All of a sudden we're not talking. That may be a time to actually dig in a little deeper and see if you can pull them away on their own and talk to them, and just say you just want to talk. Because this may be going on, it may be very difficult, and they may be afraid to want to talk, thinking that they're being watched or, listened to, monitored, especially if they answer the phone. So, listen to the way they're talking on the phone, if that sounds odd to you. So, they're just trying to hide it to save themselves because they're in such fear of what they might do or say wrong, or somebody might pick up on it and call the police, and then they have to make an excuse, which is a lot of the calls that I had. Somebody else called the police where we knew that it was the victim, but of course we would never say that the victim called, and we'd say we don't know who called, it's anonymous. And then we would just investigate the call, but we would never let anyone know that the victim has called us. And, we always let them know that too. We would never tell the perpetrator.
And to expand a little bit on what Joy said, my mom was like that. And, as teenagers, we used to make fun of the clothes that she wore. She'd wear turtlenecks or long sleeve clothes, sweatshirts, even in summer. And we made fun of, her lack of fashion sense. And when I look back on it, it was to cover the bruises, because she always wore long sleeves and pants. And like I said, oftentimes turtlenecks in the summer. So if somebody is dressing inappropriately, so they may be cold, I'm cold a lot, but just for people to keep an eye out, that if somebody is seeing somebody and all of a sudden their behavior changes and they're not quite the same person that they used to be, please keep in touch with that person. You may just have to stay on the outside of their lives a little bit. And, it's so hard to watch, but it's so important to support the victim, because isolation is such an important part of that pattern. The perpetrator wants the victim all to themselves. And again, that's part of the pattern. But keeping ties with the community, keeping friends and family ties is so important, that when the person does decide, that they may want to break that relationship off, they know that they have people supporting them.
Wow, you've given a lot to think about. We have to go to a brief commercial break, but we'll be right back.
People welcomed me, and they knew the pain of the journey that we'd been on because they'd been there too.
Other Parents Like Me is an online community, peer-led, for parents with kids struggling with mental health and or substances.
It's a space that's safe. Feels like I can actually share what's going on.
We offer 15 daily support groups per week and live speaker talks on Thursdays, as well as a monthly expert panel.
We also have a resource hub that has a toolkit. This includes over 1,000 articles, podcasts. There's a glossary with the most recent and relevant terms. And we have a directory that's been vetted.
The overwhelming feeling when we're sitting in a meeting and I'm telling my story and I see others shaking their head, tears falling, they understand this roller coaster and they're along for the ride.
And we are back with Laura and Joy. Street Smart Safety for Women, talking about domestic abuse, domestic violence. Joy, you're a former deputy sheriff. So can you talk about some of the calls that maybe you've been on that you were just like, people were not believing, or, the victim doesn't believe that you would actually take their side? Because a lot of times it's he said, she said, and you get called to what are some of the evidence things?
Yes, that was a really big problem of going to the domestic violence calls, where they're both trying to get their story out. And usually he is overpowering her story or making excuses for why the phone was ripped out of the wall. Well, she was going to hit me with it. So he is turning around everything. And law enforcement is well aware of these excuses and the ploys that parties use in the cases of domestic abuse and disturbances. So, we were always ready for, all right, let's hear what the story is. So, usually what we would do is, and let me just stop and say that any domestic call was usually so violent that we could never go, or the thought would be that it would be that violent and escalate that we could never go to a call by ourselves. And all police departments would be like this. It was at least two people. And depending on what the victim was saying on the phone, maybe half a dozen officers would go, just because, they're asking questions on the way, trying to figure out, are there weapons? What have they done right now? Are they still home? They're trying to get a quick history, especially if we've never been there before. So we don't know if they've been in prison, are they on parole or probation? Just the more they're trying to get out very quickly is very tough sometimes from the victim, because, well, they're about to lose contact, usually on the call, because the, abuser doesn't want them to tell the police that much before we get there. And so usually what we would do is separate them if we can immediately, and, see if who needed aid or, what the story was at the time. But, usually the woman just wouldn't want to tell us the story right away. And it would be very difficult sometimes to get it out, because she's like, well, you're not going to believe me. I'm sure you're going to believe him. And, we'd have to reassure them time and time again. No, we just want to hear your side of the story, not believing anyone. We just want to hear your side. And that's why it's so important to be specific and just tell the whole story, because he is going to lie. And I'm sure of that. I've had hundreds of cases and I knew they were lying. So it's important to always call the police to get your story out, no matter what it is. I mean, you don't have to be injured to call the police, but it is important to get it out for whatever happened. You had an argument and he ripped the phone out of the wall. He broke your phone, something to the point that you're in fear and, you don't know if it's going to happen again. But it is important, because what happens is your address becomes a history. And the police know we've been out there and it's all a log. So this way, the police go out there again. They already know, oh, last time he had a gun. Last time he threatened her with this. So this way, more police are sent. And of course, they're going to do all they can to protect you.
Laura, did you have that particular, were the police ever called for your parents?
Interestingly, not to our house as many times as it happened. I mean, it was so regular, and the thought of even calling law enforcement truly was just laughable. And I'm not making light of it. Now, having said that, I will say that, in recent years, when I've spoken with some of my cousins who were related to my dad, some of their families called the police time and time and time again. But, back then the police weren't as sensitive to domestic violence situations as they are now. Not to say that they're overly sensitive, in many cases. However, it never once occurred to me to ever call the police. And, looking back on it, I think, well, how could it not? But, it was just really a fact of daily life.
See, that's the question I was going to ask, is the way it's changed over the years. Before it was don't ask, don't tell, it's like hush, hush, it's like a family secret. But now it seems like more women are coming out and using their voices. Why do you think that is?
We talk about in our book, one of the huge turning points in the domestic violence awareness movement was actually the O.J. Simpson case. So O.J. Simpson, Nicole Brown Simpson, we all know the story. And Marcia Clark, when she was prosecuting the case, did not think she had anything to prosecute O.J. on. And then the bank called her and said, we have a safety deposit box. Can you send somebody down to drill it open? And the LAPD drilled open Nicole Brown Simpson's safety deposit box. They found letters that OJ had written to Nicole apologizing. They found pictures that Nicole had put in there of when she had been, the aftermath of OJ's violence against her. She had some logs in there. At one point, the police had been called, Joy talked about repeat visits. The police had been called, Nicole had called the police on OJ 8 times, at least 8 times. And the 8th time they come out, but most of the LAPD was starstruck because he was OJ Simpson. And so the 8th time OJ's like, hey, this is the 8th time you guys have been out here. This is a family matter. We don't need the police. Go ahead and leave. And Nicole had noted that in her safety deposit box. And finally, Marcia Clark had something to prosecute OJ on, and that was domestic violence, showing his jealousy, which would then show motive for the murder. And that was really the turning point, because people started to realize that if it could happen to somebody like Nicole Brown, it could happen to anyone. And, it's still an uphill battle, because many people still consider it a family matter and not really what it is. And that's a crime against a person, an assault against a person, which would not be tolerated if those people were not in a relationship.
Yeah, documentation. That's what I got from that is document. How important is documentation?
Very important. You want to have as much information for the police, in case this has to go to a jury. So, the more that you have, if you can secretly record, if you can, keep diaries, pictures. And the other thing is give it to a very trusted friend. So you don't want to, if you take it with your phone, you download it and give it to your friend. So in case they go through your phone, it's not on there. Any pictures that you've taken, print off, give to give to a friend. And, at least say, keep this along with, some safe stuff. So this way you can have your safe kit, your passport, anything that can be destroyed by them, in your home, give to a trusted friend and just say, just keep this in case I have to leave the house, in case I have to go to an attorney. At least you have all this, and, it's backup for you, because everybody doubts the word, and, they want to give the benefit of the doubt to the perpetrator a lot. And that's what the defense wants you to believe in court. So this way, if you can have pictures, or, also if you can, this is why it's important to tell a friend. This way, they can also stand up for you in court and to law enforcement as a witness. It's helpful.
Now, I will say a lot of women I know are shamed and they don't feel like they can reach out to a friend and do this. So if they don't have that esteem for themselves to say, I need to give this to you as to a friend, how else do you suggest they do it? Like you said, Nicole Brown Simpson had a safety deposit box. Is there something else someplace where they can kind of keep the files and everything together if they don't feel like they can trust a friend with it?
They can even go to one of the victim advocates, and they can help them connect with, different ways to keep their information secure, because they take care of domestic violence victims on a daily basis. So at least, if they can connect with the police will connect them with the advocates, which is very helpful.
So how do you go about finding an advocate? Because I know a lot of people ask that question, or like, I don't think there's any resources out there for me, because they're not aware, because they're not really searching for them. So how would they search for them?
If they can connect with them through a police department, the police department can connect with them at the court. Sometimes they have access to them even at the police department, depending on how large the department is, but definitely at a courthouse.
Mm-hmm. The other way is online. I think it's the hotline.org, mm-hmm. and they have resources that can provide women anywhere in the country, including the territories, the U.S. territories, with advocates that can help them. We have communicated with them. We've worked with them. They are amazing. And I can't even recall the statistics of the calls that they take, but somebody is always available 24/7. And you can chat with them online as well. If you don't feel comfortable speaking with them and you're afraid that you might be overheard, you can chat with them online. And if you think that mm-hmm. somebody is monitoring your PC or your phone, you can go to the library and use the computers at the library.
And that victim advocates can help you through your whole court process if you're going that route, which is very helpful, and it's free. But, a lot of people are scared of the court process and they don't want to go alone, or what do I do when they're getting out of jail or they're getting out of prison? So you're notified through the Vine system, which is an electronic system that notifies you when somebody is being released from prison or from jail. So at least this way, you're not surprised. You'll know when they're getting out and what you can do about it and who you can contact. So the victim advocate is such a helpful person to help you through the whole process. Pretty much will say holding your hand in the courtroom even.
I love that. Now, I do have a question. A lot of women that are victims of domestic abuse have children, and they don't want to leave the domestic abuse situation because they're scared they're going to lose their kids. What do you say to that? How do you tell the women that there's help and that they're not going to lose their kids, that to reassure them that when they're stepping forward asking for help, it's not because of, like I said, they're going to lose their kids, because a lot of women stay in that situation because of the kids.
And I do believe that they should be reassured that the court wants to keep them together. Mm-hmm. And, it is a good idea to stay together with the children, not necessarily in the abusive environment, but you will stay together with your children. So, even if you're having the abuser arrested, you're with your children, they will make arrangements for you to be with your children.
And most of the shelters that we've spoken with, the women bring their children to the shelter. The shelters expect the women to bring their children.
And now there are even more shelters with pets. So they want to keep that family together, which, the pet in a lot of the domestic violence situations is a really big issue, because a lot of the threats are against the children and the pets, which is horrible. So, don't think that if I leave, I can't take the children or the pets, or even if they're threatening you that if you leave, I'm keeping the kids. Well, and that's a reason right there to contact the police, because it's only going to escalate once they start threatening that.
And the abusers use the pets and the children for one reason and for one reason only, and that's to control the victim, And, such as our family, we were a family of violence, but the whole point was to use that violence to control my mother. And that is always the case. That's always the perpetrator's goal. It's to control that one victim, and everybody else is sadly a tool in order to do that, and collateral damage.
Another issue that has been escalating over the years is murder-suicides. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people will say, oh, they were so quiet, the family. Well, a lot of times you're not going to see the family, and that's the problem with domestic violence. So they see somebody waving and they think everything is all good. But the suicide part of it is, a lot of times the abuser puts that out there ahead of time to make you feel sorry for them. Mm-hmm. So you were about to leave and they throw out, well, if you leave, I'll just kill myself. Mm-hmm. Well, that thought, that black cloud over your head is put there by them to make you think about it and put the brakes on. But that's the time that you should not stay, because you don't know that they're not thinking of themselves and doing worse. So that is a time to, once they start threatening that, you do need to make a plan to exit that environment.
And also, too, I want to add to that. It also could be a catalyst that if that happens, unfortunately happens to a friend, that could be a catalyst for you to look at your own situation and say, I don't want that to happen to me, and get out. Because I had a friend who, her best friend, her husband shot the best friend and the kids. And she looked at her situation and said, I don't want to be in this situation anymore. And it was a very volatile divorce, but she got out of the situation. She had the courage to get out. So I actually want women to listen to this and know that, sometimes it's not always going to end up happy endings. It's sometimes you have to get out and it may be a struggle at first, but it's better for you in the long run.
Right.
And your family.
Exactly.
So let's start talking about street smart safety for women. Why did you write this book?
I wrote the book. I kicked this book off in my head at that aha moment that I told you about, that, when I realized and correlated my mother's change in behavior, change in personality, total change in character with the violence that occurred in the traumatic brain injury. Because I have to tell you, I hated my mother for years, and I thought that her mental illness, it was something I held against her. But when I realized that even as familiar as I am with violence, and that I just accepted it as normal, and that could have caused her behavior, I thought, if I didn't realize that, how many other people don't realize that as well? And so when Joy and I talked, I said, people have to find out about this. People have to know that this is a pattern. They have to know that this is not the fault of a victim, and that truly there are so many unforeseen things that are underneath that iceberg, that really I felt it became a passion project.
And I realized through all the years of working on the street, handling the many calls of violence, and just dealing with the manipulative personalities and the predators, that women needed to know more, that you were being taken advantage of, and you need not to ignore the red flags of these people.
Why do you think it's so hard for women to stand in their power? Because it's very important that they stand in their power, but why do you think it's so hard for them to do it?
One of the things we talk a lot about is our social conditioning, is that we as women, we're naturally empathetic. We're naturally generous, really. And that our social conditioning has caused us to be so polite, too polite, so forgiving, that we often put other people's safety, other people's best interest before our own. And, that shows up in predators, whether it's stranger danger, or whether it's in personal relationships, such as domestic violence and abuse. And that women, it takes us such a long time to overcome that conditioning and to stand in our power and stay in our power. Because so many times we're taught, society, conditioning, conditions try to knock us off that mark. And that's one of our messages, is that for women to not stop being empathetic, not stop being compassionate, but also to take our best interest into consideration first. It's kind of like when you're flying and they tell you, don't take care of anybody else in your family until you put your own oxygen mask on. Well, we think that is a great metaphor for living our lives.
That is so true, because sometimes women tend to take care of everybody else first, and then it's like you've got to fill your cup up first before you can fill anyone else's cup.
Right.
So what made you guys decide to collaborate together on this book?
Well, I'm going to say that with Laura's technical background, we realized that there were online issues now that were progressing. And with my background in law enforcement and the calls that I've been to and what I've seen, we just thought that it would make a good mix of, in Laura's background in family violence. We thought that putting our true stories together would help people understand more.
And truthfully, we went looking for a book that would tell women what we wrote, and we didn't find it. I mean, most of the books on women's safety are telling women to buy guns, and they are written by men for women. And quite truthfully, men who teach women's safety classes, I've been to many, for civilians. Joy certainly has had her law enforcement training, but the safety classes that I've been to for women were taught by men. And basically, they were teaching women how not to be affected by violence the way they would teach a man. So there was really no differentiation aside from telling us to walk, not to walk by ourselves or not to walk alone at night. And that was really the essence of their message. And that if we just would stop walking by ourselves at night, all our problems would be over.
No, I love that. That's the funniest thing I've heard all day.
So we realized that women aren't telling other women how to be safe. So we thought, well,
we're getting in there.
It needs to be up to us. If nobody else is going to write the book, then we're going to have to do it. And really, that's how it developed. And we didn't set out to write this like this, but we were looking for a tool and we couldn't find one, so we made it.
And we wanted to break it down into issues that we thought were being overlooked, because we've had friends that were dating and we've heard so many bad stories. So we decided, wait, this is probably something they need to know. So red flags and why is this happening? Why are you ignoring these things? What aren't you seeing? So we just thought that you need to know a few more things, how to be persuasion proof. So many women say, I can't say no sometimes. I don't know why I bought this. I don't know why I agreed to that. Why did I go out with him? I shouldn't have. So, not faulting them, but we have ways to stand up for yourself.
Speaking of ways of red flags, what are some red flags that women can look for before they're married to see maybe there's something that, red flag going up. Maybe I shouldn't continue this relationship with this person before they get into a point where it's really a bad domestic violence situation.
Well, that's one of the things that we think is probably the gist of our message, is letting young women of all ages really know that domestic violence and abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is a pattern of domination and control, oftentimes recognizable on the first date. And I would say the biggest characteristic is lack of respect. And so let's just say you're dating somebody and you've only been going out a couple times, and you say, I got to get up early tomorrow. I have an early morning. I have to go to school. I have whatever. And, the person says, well, just one more. Or, I feel like we've known each other forever. Don't leave. And you say, well, I really have to. And then the conversation goes on. As soon as you say, oh, okay, you have shown, first of all, that person has shown lack of respect by not respecting your wishes and your boundaries. And second of all, you have just shown that you can be controlled. And so you can start to look for these while you're dating. And it's so important to look for these while you're dating and to see, how does this person treat, if you're out for coffee, How do they treat other people?
Mm-hmm.
How do they treat the wait staff?
Mm-hmm.
How do they talk about their past relationships? Do they have a history of crazy exes? Well, if they do, there's only one person in common with all of those crazy exes, and that's the person sitting across the table. And if you continue that relationship, chances are really, really good you are going to be a future crazy ex. So do you have some things to add?
One of the early ones is aggression. If you see that early on, and especially with college women, you know, the guys are playing sports and they're hanging out with their pals and they're drinking. You know, if you see that aggression towards you over nothing, things that you shouldn't be physically abused, pushed, yelled at for things. Those are things early on, you know, even, oh, I'm sorry. You know, there's too many I'm sorries in there. You have to say to yourself, why is this happening? Why do I have to keep getting an I'm sorry after I get pushed or, you know, shoved or yelled at or, you know, so you need to take a step back and look at their personality. You know, are they being kind to you? You know, and not just for the date, but, you know, what is their personality? What have you heard from their friends? Have you met their friends? You know, did they say, oh, they're always like that? You know, these are things that you have to think to yourself, the one time that they hit you is the last time it should be.
And to go back to that first date or those first few dates, an important part of that domestic abuse pattern is called love bombing. And love bombing is when the person completely overwhelms you with gifts and affection and texts and everything. They show up at your door. They show up at your work. They just can't live without you. They call you 1,000,000 times a day. That's called love bombing. And the reason they do that is to make you fall in love with them. I mean, you know, that's the American dream. Oh, I'm being pursued and, you know, Prince or Princess Charming is coming. And the fact of the matter is that's the emotional hook. And once they have you falling in love with them, they know, and it's not often all conscious, it's just the pattern of the abuse. They just know how to do this, is then when the abuse starts or, you know, the disrespect starts, in your mind, you go back to how it was in the beginning and you think, oh, if I can just get through this rough spot, it'll be the way it was in the beginning. And the truth of the matter is, it's never going to be the way that it was in the beginning.
And a couple other, and that's very true, a couple other very little behaviors that are frequently overlooked is lying and cheating. So if you see that and you start catching that, you have to say to yourself, it is not going to get better. So, you know, once you catch them in multiple lies, that's a problem. You know, why are they lying to you? So, you know, these are things that you're going to start making excuses for. They're going to start making excuses. And that's not the way you want to continue a relationship. You know, you're meeting someone to go on the rest of your life with, supposedly, or to have a family with. You don't want to start out lying and catching them in situations where you constantly have to argue about why they're lying. Just say, you know, this isn't working out for me and I want better for myself.
That is so true. Do you know the statistics of children that have been in the abusive homes, if they grow up to be abusers? Do you know that statistic? Because a lot of times I know that they end up perpetrating the cycle.
Yes.
Well, I will use my family as an example, as exhibit A. The statistics are, I want to say 2/3. So, but to take my own family as an example, so my father had 5 brothers. There were 6 boys in the home. My grandfather was violent. All 6 of them grew up to be abusers. So it is generational because, if you are especially a young man who has grown up being controlled by somebody else, you're going to say to yourself, that is never going to happen to me. Now I'm going to be the controller. Now I'm going to be the boss. And they want to be the boss of everything at the expense of everything. And, my father never accepted responsibility for himself. And he always was the one that had to be right. And, the next time it was always going to be worse. So I would, 2/3 comes to mind, but it is an incredibly high statistic because, they grow up and they see that and they don't want to be in that same situation as an adult.
Wow. Laura, can you also talk about, since you said you were a witness to all this in your family, can you talk about being a child witnessing? Because I think a lot of women think, oh, I have to take it. But if they actually see it through the viewpoint of their children, that it may be the ha-ha moment that they need to get out and leave.
Okay. Growing up with it, we heard and saw everything. And, as a child, it impacted me in a couple of ways. First of all, hearing that violence almost on a daily basis, it was terrifying. And I would want to go out and help my mother, but I was scared to. And, for so many years, I berated myself. I felt guilty because I didn't go out and help her until I was finally able to understand that there was nothing I could have done as a child because, the same thing would have happened to me. And, both of my parents were drank a lot. They were both alcoholics. And certainly there was nothing I could have done as a small child to change any of that outcome. And the second thing I'll add from a personal perspective is I grew up thinking that violence was normal. And as the oldest, that's how I got my siblings to do what they were supposed to do. Both my parents drank and were violent towards each other, my mother in self-defense. But, I would use violence as a tool to control my younger siblings. And, I have not done that in adulthood, but it did become really a conditioned response. And if all you have is a hammer, every situation in life is going to look like something that has to be pounded. And, as I said, I grew up as an adult to not be a part of violence, but it was a big turning point in my life when I just realized that I took violence so much for granted that it never occurred to me in any level until that moment that violence would have any kind of impact. I thought, what? Anybody can survive violence. All you got to do is keep breathing. And if you're alive the next day, then you're good and life is going to continue on. So it's really been a change in my thought process to understand that violence is not normal, nor should it be tolerated at any level.
So at what age were you? I don't want you to actually tell the age and stuff, but what age did that finally kind of click in your head? Because I don't think people realize the long-term effects of violence.
I was over 50.
Wow.
So it was, over 5 decades of accepting the fact at a subconscious level that violence is just such a part of life that if you're alive the next day, you just keep going and you don't look back. And to understand, as I said, the research about traumatic brain injury, my mother fit the pattern of traumatic brain injury and all of the effects. She could have been a classic case. So we look at traumatic brain injury from the perspective of sports figures, soccer and football. but there are probably hundreds of thousands of women who suffer from traumatic brain injury, lack of memory, personality change, aggression, et cetera, et cetera. How many of these women suffer traumatic brain injury and they go for medical help and they are never once examined for brain damage?
Wow. I've got tears in my eyes hearing your story. I mean, just like over 5 decades. Wow, that's just blows my mind even more. Our time is almost up, but is there one last little nugget before we talk about where people can find you and find your book that you want to stress? Either you didn't think it came up in this conversation, or that you want to stress, both of you guys, that you want to stress to make sure that women understand.
I am going to say it is never too late. I don't care where you are in your life. It is never too late to get out of a situation, to turn a situation around, to do something different. And it is never too late to realize and to look back, as I did, that maybe things weren't always the same way that they seem. And no matter where you are, there is always help. People are always there for you. And just do whatever it is that you need to do.
And I say, don't doubt yourself. And if you need to call the police, call the police. Believe that they're going to help you, and believe in the court system. They will help you. The advocates will help you. You can leave. People will help you.
That is so true. Now, your book is called Street Smart Safety for Women, Your Guide to Defensive Living. Where can people find it?
StreetSmartSafety.org is our website, and our book is available wherever books are sold.
And I have the Amazon link up here because it's just a lot of people just like to shop Amazon. So I figured that's universal for everybody.
Right. Thank you.
Joy and Laura, thank you so much for coming on and for sharing. And I can't wait to have you back again, because I know we have another one scheduled. I think it's in March, I think.
It is.
But I plan on having this one to start off February, because February, you think of hearts and flowers, but a lot of people, I think, a rise of domestic of violence goes up in February because of the centered around the Valentines and everything.
Yes, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
All right, guys.
I look forward to seeing you again.
I will have in the show notes all where you can find them, as well as putting in the domestic abuse hotline, because I like the fact that you said you also can go online and chat with them. Because I think even suicide prevention hotline now has it where you can go in online and chat, because a lot of people don't feel like picking up the phone and talking. So I will put that, because I think that's very helpful for everybody as well. So until next time, guys, be blessed. If you are in a domestic abuse situation, please, please, please reach out for help. It's stronger for you to reach out for help than to sit there and take all that. So, and there's somebody out there that's going to be willing to listen to you. So until next time, bye.
Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.